This is the recorded lecture for MVC Web APIs. First of all, let me apologize. I've got a cold, so if this sounds a little rough and scratchy, it is not your speakers, it is my voice. So, that being said, just want to kind of kick through what API, Web API is within MVC and how it works, and more specifically, what things to be aware of when you're writing web APIs, what things to look out for when you're making those calls using web APIs. Um, One thing that I won't get into in this lecture, but is relevant, is the use of what is referred to as um, XML HTTP response and requests, and they're asynchronous. They're covered in the textbook, or if you like, you can also just look at jQuery's AJAX method. Um, there's a lot of details in there, but it's a little bit beyond the scope of this lecture, so I'm not going to cover it a lot, but I am going to use Fiddler, or sometimes referred to as Fiddler 2, um, to test out our web service so that you can kind of see a little more under the hood exactly what's happening with our web APIs and how we push and pull data. Alright, so to start off, what I did is I created just a real simple model class called student. It has a first name, last name, student number, and birth date, so nothing out of the ordinary. From there, I went ahead and added a service controller. And to do that, I went under controllers. I right-clicked, did add new controller, and then I called my controller service, but we'll call this sample. And then from the template drop down, normally we end up with an empty MVC controller. I went down further and chose an empty API controller. There's also controllers that are pre-templated for read-write based on entity framework elements or just basic read-writes. I'm going to go ahead and choose this empty one with read-write actions just so you can see what it generates. Alright, so we now have a sample controller, web API controller, and a service controller. I'll get into the service controller in a minute, but let's look at the sample controller. You'll notice here that we have a series of methods, and the methods are get with an ID parameter, post, put, and delete. Now those all may look a little unusual and why it gave the methods those names. The reason for that is that Web API is underneath the classification of RESTful APIs, and what that means to you and I is that when a request is made to these web APIs, not only where it's calling to, where the request is calling to, but the type of HTTP method that is invoked with the call means a lot to these API calls. So if you think back, or if you're not familiar with, there are basically four different method types. There's actually a number of additional ones, but the four primaries are get, post, put, and delete. So our methods in our controller, or what we were previously calling actions, are named akin to those four HTTP methods. Now you'll notice here that get returns IEnumerable as string, has no parameters. This get returns a single string and has an ID parameter. The Web API framework helps in much the same way MVC does, where it'll look at the calling URL and the parameters that may or may not be passed to it, and then invoke the appropriate method based on those factors. So these are both gets, this one on line 13 and line 19, but the one on line 13 isn't expecting any parameters. The URL is API/sample. The one on line 19 with the ID is actually API/sample/5, 5 being the ID value that's passed in. The post is an HTTP post, And this is API slash sample again, but it's using the post method when it's invoked or when it's called. So this post method gets called upon a post to the API slash sample, and then this is a little helper attribute to tell MVC that go get this value from the body of the post. So when you look at the structure or construct of an HTTP call, it has a header and a body. And in this case, we're giving a hint to tell the MVC framework that the value that we're looking for lives in the body of the HTTP post. A put, much like a post, again, it's the method name put. This time we're passing in the ID, which is in the sample here above is shown as API slash sample slash 5. So this 5 is this ID. And then the actual value again is coming from the body. So we have that from body attribute, and then the value that's coming out of the body will be stored in the value parameter for string. Last option or last method is delete. So the last HTTP method that we're handling is a delete method, and again it's API slash sample. Using the delete method and passing the number 5 for the ID would then execute this method. So those are the 4 basic method types, and if you want to think about them as CRUD or create, read, update, or delete, your read is get, your create is post, your update is put, and that's why with the put you have an ID value and a string coming from the body, where the post just has the string body value. So that's the difference here. This is a create, no ID needed. This is an update record ID 5 with the value that's coming from the body. And then delete is delete, so delete record 5. Alright. A couple other quick things just to make you aware of. Under the app start, there is a web API config, and this should hopefully look a lot like our route config. Basically, it is a route config, but it's configuring the API route. So if you look at the route template, it's API slash controller slash ID. Again, you'll notice there's no action defined compared to a standard route. And the reason for that, this is a standard route, the reason for that is because the APIs do not respond to actions, they're responding to HTTP methods. So again, that's why we get that get, post, put, and delete that shows up in our controller. Okay. So what I've gone ahead and built is I created a private array of students. So this is kind of going to be my data source. Normally you would pull from a database, but just for simplicity I just created this array of students that I'm going to use. And then I actually created 2 methods. The first method is get students, and the second method is create students. Now you may be looking at this and go, well, these aren't get and post. It says get students and create students. And that's correct. A few things that I wanted to also make you aware of is that because the word get is in this method name, the framework will look at this as the method that handles any gets to this particular controller. So whenever I go in and I type API slash service or services, because that's the name of my controller, and I do that as a get, I will get this method called. Since create method handles my post request, but it doesn't have the word post in it, which just doesn't feel natural to me, I went ahead and decorated it with an attribute that says HTTP post. So this call, if I do a post call to API slash services, what it'll do is it will actually take a new student that's passed in, and I can also add from body here if I want to clarify that. And then what will happen here is all students, I will then do a union and add the new student and then return all students, including the new one. Again, since this is an array, we can't really save that data, so I'm just responding or replying back with the new collection of students to show that the insert was done. Alright, so I'm going to compile all of this, and this project, while it's a basic website project, it doesn't actually have any controllers or views set up. So when I just launch the app itself, I just get this, you know, server error. What I'm going to go ahead and navigate to is API/services. And you'll notice here that I get a list in XML format of my array of students, and it even calls the parent element array of students, and then each student has a birth date, first name, last name, and student number, corresponding to the values from the array. The reason it comes through in XML format is because the browser is telling the web APIs that the preferred response type is XML, and the web APIs respond accordingly. So you'll notice a few things if you really think about what's happening. This method is getting called because we're doing a GET to the service API controller. And then that call is taking our array of data and it's actually serializing it into XML for us. Pretty nice. But we can also get other formats of data from this, as well as add additional methods here to extend the functionality. So let's say we want to do public student array. We can say get students by ID, and then, or we'll say get students by year. This will be their birth year, so then we'll say int year, and then we'll just do a quick return all students where the student's birth date year equals that year, and we'll return to array. So F6, recompile. And then if we come back and reload this, we will still get our list of full students. But then if we do question mark year equals 1960, it returns back just the two students that have a birth year of 1960. Pretty good. So that's a quick and easy way of filtering our data. Oops, sorry about that. Alright, so what I'm going to go ahead and do now is I want to jump into Fiddler. And if you haven't downloaded Fiddler before, I recommend it, especially if you do a lot of web development. It's a really great little tool, and it gives you the ability to watch your HTTP requests and responses, as well as compose your own, and then see how those responses work. This version of Fiddler will also hook into your web browser, so you can actually watch as you're browsing the internet. You can capture all of your HTTP traffic and see that data kind of flowing in and out of your browser between your browser and the server. Alright, so what I'm going to do, and I kind of had something preset here, but we'll go ahead and wing it. I'm going to change my type to a GET, and then I'm going to paste in here this URL. Let me just quickly grab that and move that off because I'll need that a little later. Alright. And then we'll move that off as well. Alright, perfect. So, I'm going to go ahead and execute this GET, and what you'll see happening is that we'll get a new line. Let me actually clear this and do it again. Execute. And what's happening is that this HTTP GET request is being sent to this address, which is the local server I'm running on, and then I can double click on it and I can do what's called inspecting the request response. So here's the HTTP request that's sent to the server. I'll give it to you in the raw format here. So get from localhost API/services where the year equals 1960. My user agent is Fiddler, And then my content length is 0. My content type request is application slash JSON. So I'm requesting JSON data as my response type. So what the server does is it says, okay, returns content with no caching, and then it returns to me a JavaScript JSON notation array of all my students. If you're not familiar with JSON, I recommend just kind of refreshing yourself on what JSON is, but basically it refers to JavaScript object notation. And it's just kind of a short way of defining objects in a very lightweight way versus XML, which often can be considered heavy, and giving you the implementation of what your students look like. So you'll notice first name Steve, last name Job, student number, birth date, comma, and then there's first name William, last name Gates, student ID, and birth date again. Okay. So that's the idea of what your browser is kind of doing behind the scenes or under the hood when you're making certain HTTP requests. Now we could also change this application type to XML. Oh, I'm sorry, let me go to the composer and say application XML. And we'll run that again. And we'll look at the raw format, and you'll see now array of students. And there's our student with a birth date, first name, last name, and student number. Fiddler's also nice. It has parser, so here's an XML parser. It's basically deconstructing the XML into something that's a little more readable. If we go back to our composer and change it back to JSON, run it again, double click, it knows that the response was JSON, and then again unpacks it into a more readable format. So nice little thing that Fiddler does for us. Okay. So the piece that I had in here when I first launched was a post, and what I'd like to call now is the create student. So I want to be able to push a new student into my quote-unquote database. So I have this header that I pre-constructed. I'm going to go ahead and use that. And then I have this line of JSON that I also pre-constructed. And I'm going to add Michael to my array of students. So I can drop this school year. So again, I'm just going to do a post to API/services. And using Fiddler, I'm going to have my local host. My content length is 99 bytes. And then my content type will be application/JSON, so I'm sending JSON in there. I'm also going to do two other things. I want to put a breakpoint here, and I'm going to attach to the debugger. And I'm just going to stop here when we call the insert. So we'll go ahead and execute our method, or our API call, and what we'll notice here is a few things. So one, we ended up hitting this method call, student. Mousing over student, I can actually unpack this and we'll see that there's the birth date, Michael Dell, and the student ID number. And you might go, oh, okay, that's nice. But if you think for a moment, what it really just did for you is it took that string of JSON that we sent and it serialized it and created a student class or an instance of student for us and stored inside of it these values. So it did that mapping like we see it do with MVC a lot. So it did that for us, and then all we have to do is we add it to all students, and then we return the new collection of all students with all 8 students in there, the 8th being Michael Dell. We'll hit continue, and we'll inspect the response. So there's what we sent as JSON, and then here's the array or the collection with all students, including Michael Dell. So in a nutshell, that is basically what you would see, or how you would interface with these web APIs. Let me just do this real quick. jQuery Ajax. If you're not familiar with jQuery, I'd recommend just looking into it. It is part of the basic website. If you go under scripts, you'll notice that jQuery is included in the basic website for MVC. And the method that you would be most interested in is jQuery.ajax. This method has a whole lot of functionality to it, and what it basically is doing for you is it helps you facilitate doing Ajax calls. So the idea is that you're on a web page, you want to make a call out to a service that you've built, a web API service, and pull some data or push some data. So that's how you get these very interactive web pages where you fill out a form, you hit a button, and then instead of it doing a full post back, it simply says your user is created, or you can do real-time searching. So like Google's instant search. So when you're on Google's page and you type something like Microsoft, and you'll notice that you get these options in real time. What's happening here is that Google is actually doing a web API call out to their services and passing in the information that's typed in, and then refreshing this page with the responses. So it just feels very fluid, very native, but there's a lot of real work. If you think about the little bit that we just did, there's a lot of real work that's going on here, because not only are they giving you suggestions, but they're actually refreshing the page behind as I mouse down through these suggestions. So there's a lot of really complex things that are happening behind the scenes there to make that happen. And one of the great tools that helps facilitate that is this jQuery.ajax method. So the reason I show you all of this, I want to make you aware of it, is that I am expecting you to create one controller that facilitates web APIs, and I also want you to then utilize that API via something like the jQuery Ajax method. So these are very important components. If you're doing any sort of web development, even if it's not MVC or .NET related, the jQuery.ajax is a great little thing to kind of keep in your toolbox, because it gives you a lot of functionality. And jQuery in general really gives you a lot of functionality just within your web development. Alright, so that is everything that I have. I'm recording this lecture 2 days before Thanksgiving, so if you're listening to it before then, happy Thanksgiving. If not, completely disregard that happy Thanksgiving. But that is it for this week. So if you have any questions, as always, you're welcome to email me. If not, I will see you next week. Thanks.